Hello and welcome to the Sunflower Quilt Chat podcast. We'll be chatting patchwork, sewing, quilting, quilt stories, advice, tips, techniques, discussions, the occasional guest, quilting design thoughts, and much more. All the quilty chat you could want. We look forward to you joining us. Hi everyone, it's Rayleigh here from Sunflower Stitcheries and Quilting, and welcome to episode 4 of the Sunflower Quilt Chat podcast. This episode we are talking about long arm quilting. When I say to someone that I am a long arm quilter, they look a little bit confused. They will often look at my arms and then they ask, what is that, generally? So it's a little bit, I guess it depends on the person and their interests as to how much detail I might go into when I answer that question. But I guess my short answer is that I quilt for other people, and I have a machine that stitches through all the layers of a quilt based on a frame. And the main difference is that instead of moving the fabric through the machine, I'm moving the machine over the fabric. It depends on, again, their interest as to whether I might pull out my phone and show some pictures or not. So the equipment that I have in my studio is a long arm quilting frame. There are different types of machines. Once you get larger than a domestic sewing machine, then you have your quilting machines that are specifically designed to have a larger throat, because for any quilting or any machine, sewing machine, the throat space is the limiting factor. How much fabric can you put inside that throat space is what determines what projects that you are able to attempt. Mind you, I have seen fantastic, award-winning, show-stopping quilts done on a domestic sewing machine. They are absolutely amazing. So if someone says to you, oh, to do that you need to have a long arm machine, that's incorrect. There have been many quilts, beautiful, stunning quilts. If you're looking at the quilting, not just the piecing, if you're looking at the quilting, and they have been done on a domestic sewing machine. Now, it may have been one of those larger designs with the larger throat, but it's still a domestic sewing machine, as opposed to my quilting machine, which has an 18-inch minimum throat. So there are, I guess, you step up. You can step up from a domestic sewing machine to a quilting edition sewing machine, which has the larger throat space. It might have a table that comes with it so that you can have that bigger flat surface to maneuver the quilt on. Then you can step up to a short arm machine or a mid-range machine, and sometimes this can be a sit down, and where you sit at the head of the machine, you're actually sitting at it differently to what you would at a domestic machine, where you're sort of sitting along one long side. So there are different ways that you can operate those machines. All of those are still to the point where you are pushing the fabric, the quilt sandwich, through the machine. With a long arm machine, or it could be a mid arm, which just means it's smaller than a long arm, and it's on a frame, this is where it switches over and we are holding the fabric on rollers and we are quilting by moving the machine. If you want to think about it, then in this way, we are drawing with thread. So by moving the machine, you are stitching in a line and moving the machine to create the quilting line, as opposed to moving the fabric and the machine is stationary and you are stitching the quilting line that way. Just flips it around a little bit. So we have a long arm quilting machine. I have 2 in my studio. I'm going to do a studio tour later and I will describe as much as I can If you're listening to the audio, if you would like to see it, then I suggest you head over to the YouTube podcast where you can see it as well. So my machine has a frame. It has a frame that stands on the ground, on the floor, and it's got a minimum of 3 rollers. And they hold the backing fabric between those two, the main two rollers, and then there's also one that I can roll the quilt top, the flimsy, onto to keep all that straight. I actually don't do that. That's not a technique I do. I what's called float my quilt tops, and there's different reasons for that. I can go into that another day. So there is the frame. My machines are on a 14-foot frame and a 12-foot frame. So they're quite long. They take up quite a bit of space in the studio. And both machines are 23-inch machines with at least an 18-inch throat space. So I can quilt most things quite easily. And it's a lot of fun. If you go bigger than that, and they do make long arm machines that are bigger than mine, the actual head, the machine head, they get a bit heavier. They're ideal if you've got computerization on that head, because that sort of controls it a little bit easier. But I don't know that you gain a huge amount. Some other long armers might disagree with that, and that's okay. I'm happy with the ones that I've got, and I'm happy with the size that I have. So that's the frame and the machine. The machine is an industrial machine, basically. It is fairly unbreakable, in saying that they can be a little temperamental. I will say 2023 has probably been my most frustrating year when it comes to tension on a machine. And I have said for many years that I encourage people to not be afraid of their tension dial. And I do understand why people get very frustrated with sorting out tension. And a lot of domestic machines, you don't need to adjust it very much. On a long arm quilting machine, you do, based on your thread choices, your fabric, sandwich, what the quilt is made of, and whether you're using the same thread, so your thread combination. Even down to, I will say, the humidity of the day can change, can affect the tension, and you need to change it. It's a bit of a challenge. All of these things are part of the learning curve when it comes to quilting. All right, so I wrote myself a bit of a list of, trying to explain to people what happens when a quilt goes on a long arm quilting machine. So there is a quilt behind me, and I want you to try and imagine that there are, if I have the backing of the quilt, just the backing, so we haven't got the quilt quilted together yet. The backing is attached to the quilt frame with the good side, the outside, the right side, facing downwards, because we actually want to show that. We don't want to quilt it to the inside of the quilt. Then we have the layer of wadding. So I would attach the backing to the rollers, and then I will lay my wadding on top of the backing and then stitch a straight line, which gives me a straight edge to start from. Then I will put the quilt top in alignment with that straight edge. And that means that I am starting square, because ultimately, if you've made a square quilt, it's not necessarily square as in it's perfectly square. It could be 60 by 60 inches. What I mean is that we're starting from a true edge. So we've got a very straight edge. We can keep the quilt. Most quilts are square or rectangular. Most, not all, but most. And then we can make sure that it stays as true to its size and its shape as possible by creating that straight edge to start from. And that's basically how we set it up. From there, I can either, depending on the machine, I will put it on. If one of my machines I have dedicated to free motion or custom work, which is what's behind me. You can't see the detail of the quilting a lot in this one, but it's all custom quilted. So there's lots of straight lines and free motion quilting in this one. So this is what I would call a custom item. The larger frame that I have a computer on it, and that's my most recent addition to the studio. And that one, I set up the machine and it quilts away. We roll on and continue that process until the quilt is quilted. So that is the basic process. Sometimes it takes a while, depends on the design and how dense it is. Depends on the day. I quilt around my family. I quilt around my family. So if there are things that the family need me for, then I will stop and help with that. But generally, the machine, once it's going, I can get a quilt done. I don't rush anybody's quilt, and hopefully that is reflected in what I provide. One of my questions sometimes is it noisy? And I will say that some machines are noisier than others. My quilting machines are both A1 quilting machine and brand, and they are reasonably quiet. So I think they are one of the quietest on the market in regards to long arm quilting machines. There are others I have seen and heard which are noisier. In saying that, it's not overly noisy. My ones are not overly noisy. The computerization has a sound that goes with it as well. It's a little bit of I guess, a digitized sound, and so it sort of sings a little bit, which can be frustrating if I'm trying to concentrate on something or other else. But overall, no, it's not terribly noisy. It's not really conducive to holding a conversation if I'm quilting, but that's mainly because I'm actually concentrating on the quilting, not because of the sound of the machine. So after the quilting is done, then what? Well, then I take it off the frame. I can put the binding on the frame. Not always. Depends on what the client wants. Sometimes they like to do that part themselves. Basically, that's pretty much it. The quilt goes on the frame, it gets quilted, and it comes off the frame. So that is, in essence, what long arm quilting is on the large machine. But in the details, there is so much more that goes into it, because the knowledge of your quilter, your long arm quilter, covers how to deal with all of the different problems that could arise, or just working in all of those different factors that are parts of quilting. And they include things like different fabric. So batik has a different sound to it when it's quilted, when it's being quilted. If it's a loose weave, if it's a tighter weave. So things like batik and japara can be a bit of a challenge. You do have to reconsider your tension and what thread you might choose for those things. The quilt sandwich, what are we putting in the middle of the quilt sandwich? A lot of it will come back to the tension and whether we need to adjust to allow for the differences in your quilt. So when I talk about a quilt sandwich, that's what I mean. What is the quilt sandwich made up of? That includes the fabric and the wadding. Also, part of that will include whether you've done applique and what you've done the applique with, whether you used what's it called? Have you used adhesive when you do applique, which can make a quilt quite stiff. You can end up with what we call gumming or residue on the needle, which can then affect the rest of the quilting. So we do need to make sure we know all of this. All of these things will be assessed when you go and see a long arm quilter, but it's something that we have to be aware of while we're quilting. And so the knowledge base of your long arm quilter is probably fairly significant when it comes to all of these different aspects of a quilt and how to quilt it well. So that is what long arm quilting is. It's got nothing to do with the physiology of the quilter, but more about the frame and the machine that we are quilting on. As I mentioned earlier, there is nothing to say that you cannot successfully quilt any quilt on any size machine, but sometimes it is easier if you can spread it out on a frame. And sometimes, to be honest, people come and see a long arm quilter because the quilting side of things is not their fun thing to do. I find it enjoyable. I find I love adding that texture, but it's not for everybody. This sort of project where there's lots and lots of detail in the quilting, this is fun to do. This was a great size to do because it's a little bit easier because it's smaller, but certainly it is the fun part for me. But I'm aware that that's not the fun part for everybody. If you have any questions about long arming, anything else about the machine that I use, then please do put a comment below and I will come back and answer those. If you have any questions, you can always message me about long arm quilting. More than happy to answer them. So until next episode, happy quilting. This is the Sunflower Quilt Chat podcast, all the quilty chat you could want. See you next episode. We are putting the frame, sorry, my phone is ringing.